It was a small, quiet town where everyone knew each other. In the middle of that town stood an old house with faded walls and a small garden that always smelled of jasmine. Inside that house lived a young woman who rarely spoke much to anyone. Most people knew her as a polite, soft-spoken person who always wore a long scarf over her head. She was often seen helping her neighbors or walking quickly to the market with her head slightly bowed, as if she didn't want to draw attention to herself. No one really knew much about her life, and she liked it that way. While others spent their evenings talking outside or scrolling through their phones, she preferred to stay inside, surrounded by silence. Her world was small but peaceful. What people didn't know was that behind her quiet face lived a heart that beat to the rhythm of music. In the corner of her small living room stood an old piano, its wooden edges slightly cracked, its keys yellowed with time. It had belonged to her grandfather, who had been a music teacher long ago. When she was a child, she would sit beside him as he played soft tunes in the evenings. He used to tell her, "Music speaks when words fail." Those words stayed with her. After he passed away, the piano became her most precious companion. Every night, when everyone else was asleep and the streets outside turned dark, she would sit in front of that piano. She would lift her hands gently, take a deep breath, and let her fingers move across the keys. The sound would fill the small house like a whisper of emotions. Sadness, hope, love, and longing all hidden inside her heart. She never had formal training. She learned just by listening, by feeling. Whenever she was sad or tired, she played. When she was happy, she played even more. The piano understood her better than anyone else. It didn't ask questions. It didn't judge. It simply responded to her touch. There was one person who knew about her secret. Her old friend from school who lived just a few houses away. Sometimes when he passed by her home late at night, he would hear soft melodies coming through the open window. At first he thought it was a recording, but one night he stopped and listened closely. The music was too real, too emotional to be a recording. Out of curiosity, he gently knocked on her door. When she opened it, surprised and a little embarrassed, he asked, "Was that you playing?" She hesitated, then nodded. From that night onward, he would sometimes sit quietly in the corner while she played. He didn't speak much. He knew that her music didn't need words. He often told her she had a gift that the world should hear, but she would just smile shyly and shake her head. "No one would want to see someone like me on stage," she said softly. "Besides, it's not about fame. It's just my way of breathing." Her days passed quietly between simple routines. She worked at a small bookshop where she arranged shelves and greeted customers politely. People liked her kindness but found her distant. She rarely joined conversations. Whenever someone tried to ask about her interests or her life, she would smile politely and change the topic. Her coworkers sometimes joked that she was like a mystery wrapped in silence. But behind that silence, her heart was full of dreams she never dared to speak aloud. She often imagined what it would feel like to play on a big stage, to let her music reach people she'd never met, to touch hearts without saying a word, but then she would quickly brush off the thought. She believed that dreams like that belonged to others, not to someone like her, someone who stayed hidden behind her covering, someone who felt invisible in a loud world. Every Friday evening, she would visit her grandfather's grave with fresh flowers. She would sit there and talk to him quietly, telling him how her week went, how the piano still sounded beautiful even though some keys had gone soft. Sometimes she would hum a tune she had recently composed, imagining he could hear it somehow. One rainy evening after she came home soaked from the storm, she felt an unusual pull toward the piano. The rain tapped gently on the roof, creating a rhythm that blended perfectly with her mood. She sat down and began to play, a tune unlike any she had played before. It started soft and slow, then rose into a storm of notes, then calmed again like a sigh after tears. It was a song of hope and pain mixed together. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she felt as if the whole world disappeared and only the music existed. Without her knowing, her friend had stopped by outside and recorded that piece on his phone. He stood there in the rain, completely still, feeling every note pierce through him. When she finished, he quietly walked back home with a thought that wouldn't leave his mind. This music needed to be heard. Days turned into weeks. Life went on as usual. She didn't know that her friend was thinking about something that could change everything for her. Meanwhile, she continued her quiet routine, smiling gently at customers in the bookshop, helping children find storybooks, walking home in the soft glow of the evening sun. But inside her, something was starting to shift. Sometimes when she played, she imagined faces listening. She imagined her music echoing through large halls. She didn't tell anyone about these thoughts, but they filled her with a strange warmth. It wasn't about pride. It was about sharing something honest, something that could comfort others the way it comforted her. She had no idea that life was preparing something unexpected. One afternoon, as she was closing the bookshop, her friend arrived with an envelope in his hand. He looked nervous but excited. "You should see this," he said, handing it to her. She opened it carefully and her eyes widened. It was a formal letter from the town's music academy, inviting her to perform at their upcoming charity concert. She stared at it, confused. "I don't understand," she said. "Why did they send this to me?" He hesitated, then admitted softly, "I sent them your recording. The one you played that rainy night?" For a moment she couldn't speak. Her hands trembled as she held the paper. "You did what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't help it," he said. "They needed performers for the charity concert. I just wanted them to hear what I heard that night. And they loved it. They want you to play." She sat down slowly, trying to make sense of it. A mix of emotions flooded her: fear, disbelief, a tiny flicker of joy, and an even bigger wave of worry. "I can't do that," she said firmly after a moment. "People will laugh. They'll stare. You know how they are. They won't listen to my music. They'll only see." Her voice trailed off, her hand nervously touching her scarf. He leaned forward. "Then let them see your courage. You don't have to change who you are. Just play, let them hear what I heard. You have something special, and it's time the world felt it too." She looked away, silent. His words stayed with her long after he left. That night she sat at the piano but couldn't play a single note. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling. What if he was wrong? What if she failed? What if people laughed or walked out? But as the night grew quiet, she remembered her grandfather's words. Music speaks when words fail. She closed her eyes and imagined him sitting beside her, smiling. Slowly her hands began to move and a soft tune filled the room again, this time gentler, like a whisper of courage. The next morning she looked at the invitation again. The concert was 2 weeks away. She folded the paper neatly and placed it inside her drawer, unsure whether she would go. But something deep inside her had awakened, a small spark of hope that refused to fade. As she walked to work that day, she noticed the world around her differently. The sound of the wind brushing through trees, the laughter of children playing, the chime of a bicycle bell, all of it felt musical. Maybe, she thought quietly, just maybe music was meant to be shared after all. That night, as she sat before the piano once again, she whispered softly to herself, "Maybe I will play, not for them, but for him, for the one who believed I could." And with that, her fingers began to dance over the keys once more, sending melodies into the night that carried more than sound. They carried the beginning of something she never expected, a story that was about to touch hearts far beyond her little home. The invitation letter stayed on her small wooden table for days. Every morning she looked at it, and every night she placed it back into the drawer. It was like a secret she didn't know how to face. Sometimes she would stare at the piano, wondering if she should even touch it again. Other times she sat quietly in front of it, her fingers resting on the keys, thinking about the words written in that letter. "You are invited to perform at the annual charity concert." Those words sounded heavy. They carried both hope and fear. Her friend stopped by often, asking if she had made a decision. She always gave the same answer: "I don't know yet." Inside her, two voices were fighting. One voice told her to stay hidden, to keep her music private, safe from the world. The other voice whispered softly that maybe it was time to step forward, to let her music breathe outside those walls. Every evening, after finishing her shift at the bookshop, she walked home slowly, lost in thought. The air in the town was cool, the streets lit by soft yellow lamps. Sometimes she would stop by the small park, sit on a bench and listen to the sound of children laughing in the distance. She wondered if she could ever laugh that freely. At home, her piano waited for her like an old friend. That night she played again, but this time her music sounded different. It was full of questions. Her fingers moved slowly, hesitantly, as if they were searching for courage in the spaces between the notes. Her mother, who rarely spoke much about her hobbies, entered the room quietly one night. She listened for a while, standing near the door, and then said softly, "Your grandfather would be proud if he could hear this." Those words touched her heart deeply. She stopped playing and looked up. "Do you think he would?" she asked. Her mother nodded with a small smile. "He always said you had his gift. Maybe now the world should know it too." That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about her grandfather, about how he used to play without fear, how music made him smile. She realized that maybe this concert wasn't about showing herself, it was about showing his spirit through her hands. The next morning, she finally picked up the letter again. She read it carefully, and at the bottom it said she needed to confirm her participation by the end of the week. Her hands shook as she dialed the number written on it. A warm voice on the other end answered, "City Music Academy, how can I help you?" She hesitated, her voice barely steady, but managed to say, "I'm calling to confirm my performance for the charity concert." The woman on the phone sounded cheerful and thanked her for accepting. She gave her the date and told her to arrive for rehearsals a few days before the event. When the call ended, she sat in silence, staring at the wall. It was done. There was no turning back now. In the following days, she practiced more than ever. Each night she played until her fingers felt sore. She chose a piece she had written herself, a melody that told her story without needing a single word. She wanted the music to speak for her heart. Sometimes doubt crept in again. She wondered if people would judge her for wearing a covering, or if they would laugh before she even started playing. But then she remembered what her friend said. They should hear your soul, not see your face, and she held on to that. As the concert day drew near, she packed her things, a small bag with her sheet music, a simple dress, and her scarf. She took a long look at her piano before leaving. The old instrument seemed to smile back as if saying, "Go on, you're ready." The Music Academy was in the city, a place full of noise, light, and unfamiliar faces. It was her first time traveling alone. When she arrived, the building looked grand. Tall glass windows, shining floors, and a large chandelier hanging in the center hall. Musicians were walking everywhere, carrying instruments, talking excitedly. She felt small among them. A kind woman from the academy greeted her and showed her to the rehearsal room. Inside, there was a big black piano that looked almost too perfect. She touched the keys gently, feeling a mix of excitement and fear. When she began to play her piece, a few people in the room stopped to listen. Their faces softened and someone whispered, "She plays beautifully." Hearing that gave her a little bit of strength. Later that evening, she was taken to the auditorium where the real performance would take place. The hall was enormous. Rows of red seats stretched far back, and the stage lights were bright enough to make her blink. She stood there quietly, imagining what it would feel like to play in front of hundreds of people. Her heart beat fast, but she also felt something else, a strange calmness, like the world was waiting for her music. Back in her hotel room that night, she couldn't sleep. She looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker. She thought of her home, her friend, and her grandfather. She whispered a small prayer for courage. Then she closed her eyes, imagining herself playing on that stage with confidence and peace. The next morning was the day of the concert. The academy was buzzing with energy. Performers were practicing their last notes, tuning their instruments, fixing their clothes. She sat quietly in a corner, her hands clasped together. One of the event organizers came by and smiled. "You'll do great," she said kindly. "Your music touched us all during rehearsal." Those words warmed her heart. When her turn finally came, she was led backstage. She could hear the audience clapping for the performer before her. The sound of applause filled her with both fear and excitement. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "Just play. Let them feel what you feel." But before stepping onto the stage, she froze for a moment. Her thoughts raced. What if the audience didn't understand her? What if they judged her appearance before hearing a single note? She almost wanted to turn back. Just then, her friend's voice echoed in her mind again. "You don't have to change who you are." She lifted her chin slightly, straightened her scarf, and walked forward. The lights hit her face the moment she stepped on stage. The room was silent. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her. Some people looked surprised. Others seemed unsure. She sat at the piano, her hands trembling slightly. For a brief second, she thought she might not be able to play at all, but then she remembered her grandfather's words, "Music speaks when words fail." She closed her eyes, took a slow breath, and let her fingers touch the keys. The first note sounded like a whisper, soft and trembling. Then another followed, and another. Slowly the melody began to form, a sound that carried emotion, warmth, and pain all at once. The audience grew still. The music filled the hall like a breeze moving through open windows. She played from her heart, every note carrying a piece of her story. The struggles, the loneliness, the hope, all of it poured out through her hands. She forgot about the audience, forgot about the lights. She was no longer afraid. She was simply living through the music. When the last note faded, the hall remained silent for a long second. Her heart pounded as she kept her head bowed. Then a single clap broke the silence, followed by another, and then hundreds more. The sound grew louder until it turned into thunderous applause. Some people stood, some wiped their eyes, others shouted words of praise. She looked up slowly, her eyes shining with tears she didn't try to hide. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel judged. She felt understood. The host came on stage, thanking her and calling her performance a moment that touched the soul. She stood, bowed slightly, and walked off stage with trembling hands. Backstage, the other performers smiled at her. Some even hugged her. One of them whispered, "Your music spoke more than words ever could." That night, as she left the concert hall, the cool air brushed her face. She looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling faintly above the city lights. Her heart felt light. She knew her life had just changed in a way she didn't yet understand. On the ride back to her hotel, she smiled quietly to herself. She thought of the small piano at home, of her grandfather, of her friend who believed in her when she didn't believe in herself. She whispered softly, "We did it." The city outside was still alive with sound, but inside her heart there was peace, a quiet kind of joy that needed no applause. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't need to. For now, she had done the one thing she never thought she could. She had stepped forward not to prove anything, but to let the world hear the voice she had always hidden. And in doing so, she discovered something beautiful. That true courage isn't about being seen. It's about being heard. Even when your voice is silent, the morning after the concert felt unreal. Sunlight spilled through the thin curtains of her small hotel room, and for a few moments she just lay there, trying to remember if everything that happened the night before was a dream. The sound of applause still echoed in her ears. It didn't feel like it had really happened. She turned her head toward the table where the invitation letter still lay. It looked ordinary, but it had changed her life. Her phone buzzed with messages. Some were from the academy, some from people she didn't know. Words like beautiful, inspiring, and unforgettable appeared again and again. Her hands trembled as she read them. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. She had spent her whole life trying not to be noticed. Now suddenly people were noticing her for something she had done with her heart. Downstairs in the lobby, a few musicians from the concert smiled when they saw her. One of them walked up and said, "Everyone's talking about your performance. The way you played, it wasn't just music, it was feeling." She thanked them quietly, still unsure how to respond to praise. Inside, she felt both grateful and overwhelmed. When she returned home that evening, the town felt smaller than before. The same streets, the same shops, the same quiet corners, but she was different now. Her mother hugged her tightly, proud and emotional. "You did it," she said softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. Her friend came over later that night, smiling like a child. "I told you they'd listen," he said, his voice full of joy. She laughed for the first time in a long while, a laugh that sounded light and free. After the concert, small clips of her performance began to appear online. Someone had recorded her playing, and people shared it again and again. The video spread far beyond their town. Comments poured in from people in other cities and even other countries. Some said her music made them cry. Others said it gave them hope. A few said it reminded them that kindness and beauty still existed in the world. At first, she didn't know how to feel about it. She wasn't used to so many eyes on her. Some journalists wanted to interview her, but she gently refused. She didn't want fame. She wanted peace. Still, she couldn't deny that something had changed. Her music was no longer just hers. It now belonged to the people who had heard it and felt something real. One afternoon, the Music Academy called again. They invited her to perform at another event, this time a televised one. When she heard the word televised, her heart jumped. She imagined cameras, bright lights, millions of people watching. For a moment she wanted to say no, but then she remembered how it had felt to sit at that piano, surrounded by silence, and let her heart speak. That feeling was worth more than fear. So after a long pause, she said yes. Preparing for this second performance was different. She practiced every day, but this time there was a new energy in her. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't playing just for herself. She was playing for all the people who found comfort in her music. She wanted to remind them that beauty could exist even in quiet, hidden places. The day of the show came sooner than she expected. The studio was larger than the concert hall. There were technicians moving around, setting up lights and microphones. The stage was shiny and modern, surrounded by cameras. As she walked through the corridors, she heard other performers laughing and chatting. Everyone seemed so confident. She felt small again for a moment. But then she remembered her grandfather's words and her fear softened. When it was finally her turn, she sat down at the grand piano under the bright studio lights. The cameras pointed at her from every angle. She closed her eyes, blocking out everything. She began to play slowly, gently, the same way she always did when she was alone at home. The melody filled the room, soft and emotional. Even the crew members stopped to listen. Her hands moved naturally, almost effortlessly, like they were speaking their own language. She played one of her new compositions, a song about finding peace after fear. When she finished, the studio was silent for a few seconds before the applause came. It wasn't as loud as the concert hall, but it felt just as meaningful. She smiled shyly and stood up, bowing her head slightly. After the show aired, the response was overwhelming. People from all over wrote to her. Some said they had lost hope in their own dreams but found courage after hearing her play. Others said her music made them feel closer to something pure and true. It was hard for her to read those messages without tears in her eyes. In the weeks that followed, her life began to change quietly. A few schools reached out asking if she could teach children music. The idea made her nervous at first, but she agreed. She started giving piano lessons at a small community center every weekend. The children adored her. They didn't care about her covering or her quiet voice. To them, she was just the kind lady who made the piano sound like magic. Watching the children play brought her a different kind of joy. They laughed, made mistakes, and tried again without fear. It reminded her of herself when she was small, sitting next to her grandfather. She told them stories about how music can speak even when people cannot. She wanted them to understand that music wasn't about showing off. It was about sharing feelings that words couldn't carry. Her mother often came to watch her teach. Seeing her daughter surrounded by smiling children made her heart full. Sometimes after the lessons ended, the two of them would sit together in the empty room and she would play softly while her mother listened. Those moments felt peaceful and complete, but despite the growing recognition, she remained humble. She still lived simply, still walked to the market with her scarf wrapped neatly, still smiled politely to people she met. The difference was that now, when people saw her, they didn't just see a quiet woman. They saw the pianist whose music had touched their hearts. One evening, as she was closing the piano cover after practice, her phone rang again. It was the director of the charity concert where she had first performed. He wanted to invite her back for the next year's event, this time as a special guest rather than a participant. When she heard that, her eyes filled with tears. She remembered how frightened she had been that first night, how her hands had shaken before she played the first note. To return now, not as a stranger but as someone who had inspired others, felt like a circle completing itself. In the days leading up to that second charity concert, she practiced the same piece she had played the first time, but now each note felt deeper, more alive. She added small changes here and there, soft touches that reflected how she had grown. She wasn't the same person anymore. She had learned that courage wasn't about standing tall, it was about standing true. The night of the concert arrived. As she walked onto the stage, the same familiar hall stretched before her, filled with people. But this time she wasn't nervous. She looked out at the audience and smiled. Some people clapped before she even began, as if welcoming an old friend. She sat down at the piano and closed her eyes. The hall grew silent. Then slowly her fingers began to move. The music rose again, filling the air with warmth. It sounded like a memory returning home. The same melody that had once been played in fear was now full of strength and peace. When she finished, the audience stood. The applause was long and heartfelt. People shouted words of love and gratitude. Some even held up their phones, recording the moment. She didn't mind this time. She simply bowed her head and smiled. After the show, many people came to meet her backstage. They told her how her music had changed something in them, how it reminded them that courage can be quiet but powerful. She listened to them all, thanking each one sincerely. Later that night, she returned home, tired but happy. The small house was quiet as always. She sat at her old piano, running her fingers gently over the worn-out keys. Then she began to play again, not for the crowd, not for fame, but for herself. The same piano that had once held her secrets now held her story. Outside, the moonlight touched the jasmine flowers in the garden. The air was cool, calm, and peaceful. As her music filled the night, she realized something simple but beautiful, that sometimes life doesn't change with loud moments or big words. Sometimes it changes quietly, like a song that starts in the dark and finds its way to the light. And as the final notes faded, she smiled softly. She had once feared being seen. Now she understood that she didn't need to hide at all. Her heart had found its voice, and it would keep singing, quietly but endlessly, to whoever needed to hear it. The following months felt like a quiet dream. The world had discovered her music, but she had not changed the rhythm of her days. She still woke early, made tea for her mother, opened the windows to let sunlight into the small house, and played the piano when the morning felt soft enough to listen. But something inside her was different now. Every note she played carried the memory of faces she had never met. People who had written to her saying her music gave them strength when they felt weak, or peace when their hearts were restless. Sometimes, when she opened her messages, she read stories from people around the world. A young boy from another country wrote that he started learning piano because of her. A woman said her song helped her forgive someone she hadn't spoken to in years. Another man wrote that her melody helped him sleep again after months of sadness. She sat by the window reading those words, tears quietly falling down her cheeks. It felt strange to touch lives she had never seen, simply by pressing keys on a piano in a small town. Her friend often reminded her how proud he was. "You didn't just play music," he told her one evening as they walked near the park. "You gave people a piece of your heart. That's why they listen." She smiled softly, not knowing what to say. She didn't feel like a hero or a star. She just felt grateful that her quiet world had somehow found its way into other people's hearts. Still, she never let the growing attention change her. She turned down invitations for big events, choosing only those that meant something real. She preferred smaller stages, community gatherings, and school programs. She liked looking into the faces of people sitting close enough to feel the warmth of the music. Fame didn't tempt her. Connection did. One afternoon, she received a call from a hospital in the nearby city. A nurse had seen her video online and asked if she could come play for the patients. The hospital's children's ward had many kids who were sick for a long time, and music, the nurse said, often made their days brighter. She agreed without hesitation. The next week, she arrived at the hospital carrying a small keyboard because the piano there was broken. The children's faces lit up the moment she entered the room. Some were sitting up. Others lay in bed with small blankets covering them, but all of them smiled. She sat down and began to play a soft tune, gentle, cheerful, full of hope. The children clapped along, some humming quietly. One little girl closed her eyes and said, "It sounds like sunshine." Those words stayed in her heart for a long time. When she finished, one of the doctors came forward and thanked her. "What you did today meant more than medicine," he said kindly. "You reminded them what happiness feels like." She bowed her head, her eyes moist. That night, as she returned home, she felt something deep inside her shift again. Music wasn't just art anymore. It was healing, it was kindness. It was a way to bring light where there was darkness. Soon after, she decided to start something new. With the help of the community center, she began a small group called Voices of Silence, where anyone, young or old, could come learn music for free. She wanted it to be a place for those who never had a chance to study art, especially those who felt they didn't belong anywhere. The first day, only 4 people came. 2 children, an older man who used to work at a factory, and a shy teenage girl who brought a small notebook full of lyrics. By the 3rd week, the room was full. She taught them how to listen first, to hear emotion and sound, to feel rhythm with their heartbeat. She didn't care if they made mistakes. She only cared that they played with honesty. "Music doesn't ask you to be perfect," she told them gently one day. "It only asks you to be true." One evening after class, she stayed back to clean the instruments. The teenage girl who wrote songs came up to her and said, "Before I came here, I used to think I was invisible. But when I play, I feel seen." She smiled at the girl and replied, "That's exactly what music did for me, too." They stood there for a moment, two souls who had found their voices in silence. As months passed, her small group began performing at local events. They played in parks and schools, even at the town square. People came not because it was a big show, but because the music came from the heart. She would often sit at the piano, letting her students take the lead, smiling quietly as their confidence grew. One day, while packing up after a performance, she received another letter. This one came from abroad. A well-known international foundation had seen her story online. They wanted to invite her to perform at a global cultural event dedicated to music beyond borders. It would take place in a grand theater far from her country. The letter praised her for inspiring millions through the language of emotion. At first, she couldn't believe it. The thought of traveling so far frightened her. She had never left her homeland. The idea of standing on a stage in front of people from different parts of the world made her heart race. That night, she sat by the piano in silence, unsure what to do. Her mother, noticing her worry, sat beside her. "You've already crossed the hardest stage," she said softly. "You found the courage to be heard. Now go and share that gift wherever it's needed." Her mother's words carried the same calm wisdom her grandfather once had. After a long moment, she smiled. "Then I will go," she whispered. The journey was long and new. When she arrived, the city looked enormous. Bright lights, tall buildings, people speaking languages she didn't understand. The event organizers welcomed her warmly and showed her the stage. It was the largest one she had ever seen, with golden lights hanging above and rows upon rows of seats stretching into the distance. For a moment, she felt that same fear again, the one she used to feel before every performance, but it didn't stay for long. She knew now that music didn't depend on place or people. It only depended on heart. On the evening of the event, artists from around the world performed before her: singers, dancers, violinists, and flutists. Each performance was beautiful in its own way. Then, when it was her turn, the host introduced her as the pianist who spoke through silence. The crowd fell quiet as she walked to the piano in her modest attire, her scarf softly draped, her hands trembling only slightly. She sat down, took a deep breath, and began to play. This time, she played a piece she had written especially for this night. It began softly, like the sound of dawn, then grew stronger, filled with both pain and hope. The melody carried whispers of her past: the lonely nights, the first concert, the children's smiles at the hospital, her grandfather's lessons, her mother's gentle voice. Every emotion she had ever lived flowed through her fingers like a river finding its way to the sea. The theater was silent. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. When the last note faded, she lifted her hand slowly and looked up. For a few seconds, there was no sound. Then the applause began, rolling through the hall like thunder. People stood, clapping, cheering, some with tears on their faces. She didn't smile widely or wave. She simply bowed her head, her eyes glistening. She knew the music had spoken for her again, just as it always had. After the show, several artists came to meet her backstage. A violinist from another country said, "I didn't understand your language, but I understood every note you played." Another performer told her, "You reminded us why we started doing music in the first place." She thanked them quietly, humbled and grateful. That night, as she returned to her hotel, she stood by the window looking at the foreign city lights. For the first time, she realized how far she had come. From a small, quiet house with cracked walls to a stage that crossed borders. She smiled softly and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Back home a few days later, she returned to her students, her piano, and her jasmine garden. Life continued as simply as before, but something had changed forever. The world now knew her, yet she remained the same gentle soul who played for love, not applause. When she sat at the piano again, she felt a calm peace. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play a melody that had no name, a song that carried all she had lived and all she still dreamed of. The music rose softly into the night air, flowing out the window, carried by the wind, touching hearts she would never meet. And as the sound faded, she looked up at the moon and smiled, realizing that her journey wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about connection, about how one honest note could reach a stranger and remind them that they weren't alone. Her music had become more than sound. It had become light, and in that light she found herself, not as a hidden pianist anymore, but as a soul who had finally stepped forward, unafraid to let her heart be heard. Time moved quietly after her return. The world outside seemed louder than ever, but inside her little home everything was calm. The piano sat by the window as it always had, and the morning sunlight still painted soft lines on the wooden floor. She no longer chased anything. She didn't need to. She had already found what her heart had been searching for all along: peace. Her students came regularly, laughing and learning in the small room that once felt too quiet. The place had changed over time. Pictures of performances, thank you letters, and colorful paper cranes filled the walls. The sound of music floated through the open window every afternoon, carried away by the wind toward the busy streets. The neighbors often paused while passing by, just to listen for a moment before continuing on with their day. One morning, as she sat on the porch, an old postman arrived with a thick envelope. It came from a city far away, sent by the organizers of the international event she had played at months ago. Inside was a letter inviting her to be part of a global music program, a foundation that wanted to build schools where children could learn music without paying. They wanted her to lead the first branch in her own country. She held the letter for a long time, feeling its weight in her hands. She thought of her grandfather's old piano, her mother's sacrifices, the children she had played for in the hospital, and her students who once believed they couldn't do anything special. All of it had led to this, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a few days to think. She walked through the streets of her small town, watching people go about their lives. Vendors selling fruits, children running behind bicycles, women carrying baskets from the market. She realized she loved this town too deeply to leave it behind. So instead of moving to a big city, she proposed another idea. She asked the foundation to let her open the first music center right there, where her journey had begun. They agreed. Months later, the old community hall was transformed into a bright new music school. There were instruments from different countries, shelves filled with sheet music, and wide windows that let sunlight pour in. People from all walks of life came to volunteer: teachers, students, even retired musicians who hadn't played in years. The day the school opened, she stood quietly near the entrance, watching families and children gather. The town mayor gave a short speech saying, "This place began with one woman who chose to play even when the world wasn't listening. Today, because of her, music will live here for generations." The applause that followed made her blush. She never liked being the center of attention, but she smiled gently, thankful for the kindness around her. In the months that followed, the school became more than just a building. It became a home for many hearts. Children who couldn't afford lessons came after school to play. Elderly people joined weekend singing sessions, laughing and sharing old songs. Parents brought their little ones to listen, and sometimes the whole town came together for evening performances. Every weekend, she sat by the piano as her students played beside her. She didn't lead anymore. She simply guided when needed. Watching them reminded her of her younger self, the shy girl who once hid her talent, afraid to be seen. Now those same hands that trembled once guided dozens of others to believe in themselves. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she stayed behind after class. The hall was empty, the light golden and soft. She sat at the piano and ran her fingers over the keys slowly. Her mind wandered back to her grandfather, the man who had once placed her small hands on the same keys and told her, "Don't play to impress. Play to tell the truth."